Welcome everyone to the first Open Pharma symposium, and it's a pleasure to see you here. At Open Pharma, we created this forum for publishers, pharma professionals, and medcoms professionals, and other people related to the publishing process, and also patients to come together and discuss trust in pharma research. What's the role for open science in that process? And now I'm going to hand over to Paul, who has been with Open Pharma since its very beginning.
Great. Thank you, Joanna. So I guess in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is move on and introduce our chair today, Richard Smith. So Richard is chair of the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change. He's also the chair of the Points of Care Foundation, which promotes compassionate, dignified care, and also Patients Know Best, a company which brings all medical and social care records together in one place under the control of patients. So Richard is also co-chair of the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death, which is an interesting topic. So I'm going to hand over to Richard. Thank you, Richard.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Paul. Well, good morning, everybody. I remember once speaking at the World Medical Library Association meeting where the man introducing me read out my entire CV in broken Japanese. And by the end of it, there was no time left for my talk. There we are. So I mean, my opening message is there is huge distrust in science, which I think has become worse since the pandemic. So I have selected a series of headlines, which I'll read out some of them to you. Only 36% of studies replicated. Is health research no longer to be trusted? Why we can't trust academic journals to tell the scientific truth, why most published research findings are false, exposed in the Mail on Sunday, the plague of fake medical trials putting lives in danger as experts reveal a fifth, in capital letters, of studies published each year could contain invented or plagiarized results. So there's a big problem of trust in science, and I have some data to back it up, which comes from a survey by the Academy of Medical Sciences back in April 2016. And they surveyed over 2,000 members of the public, a random sample. And for some of it, they also surveyed GPs. So they started with how much do you trust these different types of information? And the most trusted, by 74%, was forensic evidence, so sort of crime scene, legally admissible. And then two-thirds of people trusted the messages they got about medical information and science from their friends and family. But I suppose what is shocking is that when you look at how much people trust medical professionals commenting in the national media, it's only 38%. And when you get down to data from medical trials, it's a similar 37%. So in other words, most people don't trust the results from clinical trials. And this was back before the pandemic. So what are the factors that influence people's confidence in a clinical trial? Well, top of the list, this is a ranking, and 20% ranked it most important as the reputation of the organization which led the trial. Next comes the qualifications of the researchers who conducted the trial. How many people took part in the trial was ranked important by 10%. But I think this is the bit that's interesting to us. Whether or not there was a written analysis of the trial has been published or not was important to only 7%. They thought that was the most influential thing. And whether or not the raw data had been published was important to only 7%. So I suppose that's actually a message that a lot of the public are not that concerned about openness. And then they came on to some statements about conflict of interest, and this they asked to both the public and GPs. So researchers with a declared conflict of interest cannot be trusted to conduct clinical trials research in an independent and unbiased manner. 71% of people agreed with that. So 3/4 think that, and it's ironic, it seems to me, because if you declare a conflict of interest, then people are going to be less likely to trust it, which actually other research that I've been involved in has shown. And when it comes to GPs, it's 50-50. So in other words, 50% of GPs think you can't trust research where there's a declared conflict of interest. Publication of clinical trials in peer-reviewed journals ensures that the evidence is of high quality. Well, 2/3 of the public agree with that statement, 15% don't, and actually it's 80%, so it's 4/5 of GPs agree with that. So they do have a trust in journals, more so than the public. And here's a crunch one. Clinical trials research funded by the pharmaceutical industry is often biased to produce a positive outcome. Well, 2/3 of the public agreed with that, and actually 82% of GPs agreed with that. So there's big distrust of science and even more distrust of research that's funded by the pharmaceutical industry. How much would you trust these sources to provide an independent and impartial assessment of medical advice? And this is how much do you trust to a great extent? Well, it's 30% trust healthcare professionals, 12% academics, researchers working on clinical trials. So again, a huge level of distrust. And down at the bottom, the pharmaceutical industry, 3%. So there's a real lack of trust. And has it got worse since the pandemic? Well, the evidence seems to suggest it has. I've got here data from the US in February 2022, and you can, and the overall message is public confidence in scientists and medical scientists has declined over the last year. So if you look at medical scientists, actually there are 29% who trust medical scientists a great deal, compared with 40% before the pandemic, but 22% have no confidence compared with 14% before. So there's been an increase in distrust. There's also an increase in distrust in all scientists, and interestingly, an increase in distrust in the military. I mean, maybe the pandemic just fueled a lot of distrust all round. And this is a quote from Dr. K. Viswanath, who's the Lee Kum Key Professor of Health Communication at Harvard. All of the sudden, everyone is watching scientists during the pandemic. You remember how studies were reported daily almost. And they are seeing the messiness of how science happens. People are seeing the sausage being made, and they don't like what they see. So we had a high level of distrust. It seems to have got worse during the pandemic. So how might we increase trust? Well, that's really our topic for today. So will more openness encourage more trust? What about better systems of publishing, better systems of quality assurance? Will plain language summaries, will they encourage trust? More public education, or maybe more public education will increase distrust? Or is it something else? I don't have the answer, but I hope some people in the audience can help us arrive at the end of the seminar at some conclusions. Right, that was my introduction, which I hope took slightly less than 10 minutes. So we're going to begin with why the importance of open access to patients, and we're going to hear from Richard Stevens. Richard has been a patient advocate for over 2 decades. He also works with industry and with patient groups in Europe, Canada, and the USA. He helped found the All Trials campaign and Use My Data movement with Ben Goldacre and people. And he's the founding co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Research Involvement and Engagement. So he's just the bloke we want. But he's survived 2 cancers, a heart emergency, and continued comorbidities and late effects. He's participated in 4 international studies and 9 other studies. Richard, the floor is yours. I hope you don't collapse today.
This is actually like looking out at my doctor's surgery. This is like going to see the GP, except this is a much healthier group of people sitting there. But it's like going to see the GP because the place is full of expectant people, and we've all been told we've only got 5 minutes each to say what we need to say. So I'm going to try and link to what we've already said, and without the slides, this is going to be really interesting. Forgive me if I do walk up and down, but I do have a heart condition, and the doctor says I must get more exercise. So there is a difference between patients and public. So the topic I was given was actually about who can we trust and the importance of open access to patients, not to the deeply skeptical public. And there is a change in mindset. And some of you may have found this out yourselves already. You may well find it out later in your lives for you or someone you care about. But when you actually become a patient and you need a doctor, this whole issue of trust shifts. You're not sitting there watching television or reading a newspaper thinking, do I trust what I'm being told? You're sitting in front of someone because something has gone wrong and you actually want them to help you. Dear doctor, I have got a problem. Now, in a perfect world, just give me the prescription for 2 pills a day and I'll go away and not bother you again. Even that can cause problems. I do remember after my heart emergency waking up in the hospital and talking with the cardiologist, and a couple of days later they discharged me, and he told me, I'm going to give you some more pills. I said, oh, for goodness sake, not more pills. How often am I going to be taking these bloody things? He said, Mr. Stevens, you are going to have to take one of these pills every single morning, every single day, for the rest of your life. I said, but you've only given me 7. I had no option but to trust him, that medication. I did go away, though, as a patient activist, which is what I was by then, or advocate. I went away and actually looked up the pills, and I did the checking, and then I found out the clinical trials that had proven them, and then I came across the fact that they had been published several years ago, and they were tucked behind paywalls, and I did not have 20, 25 quid that I could be bothered to spend at that point. I was having enough trying to argue with the insurance company about how I wasn't going to be allowed on airplanes anymore. So this question of who do you trust as a patient is different from who do you trust as a member of the public. We go to people we trust for help. We actually go to charities. We go to other patient groups. We go on Facebook. We talk to people in the family who've got the same condition. We listen to other patients in the clinic. We start listening to information, even if we're not actively seeking it, from all sorts of sources. And we hear stuff that medicine is now personalized. It's precision medicine, it's stratified medicine, it's evidence-based medicine. And apparently, we even have patient choice. We have shared decision-making. And these concepts are around somewhere. I don't know what they are. Dear doctor, I've come to you for help. You know what the disease is. You damn well sort it out. I don't want it anymore. So who do we trust and where do we find our information to build that trust becomes really, really important. And increasingly, patients and our families are becoming aware that doctors are supposed to act according to evidence, whether it's in published journals or whether it's secondhand. Journal evidence that's been used to build the Royal College's guidance, the European Association of this, that, or other guidelines on, for example, new ones just out on cardio-oncology, the first ever European guidelines on cardio-oncology as one single medical specialism. And guess what? They're going to have a patient guide written to them, a guide to the guidelines. So we will have a guide, partly written by patients, to the guidelines, which our doctors are supposed to follow, and the guidelines, of course, cite the evidence. And they make judgments about how strong that evidence is. This is what doctors must do, this is what doctors could do, this is what doctors might think about doing, because there's different levels of evidence. And patients have helped draw up those guidelines. So we're beginning to get into all this. But if you want to look up the evidence, half of it is still tucked away behind paywalls. So I go to my local library, and they say, yeah, we can get it for you, but you will have to pay us a fee. Not the journal, but you will have to pay us a fee. It's only a £5, but you've still got to pay. Even if I've got the £5, it makes life more difficult if I want to know the evidence behind what my doctor is telling me. And it's as simple as that. What do I do if I want to check? You know, Chris Whitty on TV pointed to the graphs and the slides, and we all learned his catchphrase, next slide, please. And we watched that evidence, and we all tended to accept it. by and large, especially people who got COVID, because they knew it was about them. They were patients sitting in hospitals. You know, where is the new paper that we've actually tried drugs? How fast is the vaccine coming on? How many people have they tried it out on? I was a vulnerable person. I was locked up. I want that vaccine. Get on with it. Find another 1,000 people. I was really interested in actually looking at those papers, but I was more interested in just getting the needle in my arm. I have to be honest about that. So I want to trust what I'm being told. But at the same time, I want the ability to check up on it. And when someone in my family gets ill, if my kids get ill, I want to be able to check up on the evidence that's supporting their treatment. And as I said earlier, sooner or later, we are all in this position. And it's as simple as that. Open access simply means we just want to be able to check on what we're being told and make up our own minds. And bearing in mind most of this evidence is coming from us. We're the ones who participate in the studies. We're the ones who volunteer our samples, who volunteer our data. Don't we have the right to do that? And isn't it common sense? And I didn't mean to end on hypothetical questions. Let me put it the other way. If we continue not to have open access, that is simply feeding the arguments of the people who don't trust. It is fueling the debates on the internet and on Twitter, and it does beg the question, well, what is it they're hiding? What is it they're not telling us? And that is no way to move ahead with evidence-based medicine. Thank you very much.
Tremendous, Richard. Thank you very much for getting us off to that kind of powerful start. I mean, it's an interesting the difference between the public and patients. I mean, the unfortunate thing for patients is what else can you do but trust your doctors? And unfortunately, they trust them all equally and all hospitals equally. I mean, there's the famous example. They ranked, the quality of heart hospitals in Washington, D.C. And when Bill Clinton had a heart attack, he went to one of the ones with the worst outcomes. Somehow information didn't change what he did. Right. Now we're going to hear from Chris Rains, who's going to talk about open access commitment for Takeda-sponsored research. So Chris is a hero of Open Pharma. He's currently the Vice President for Global Medical Affairs for the global portfolio. It's all global, at Takeda Pharmaceutical Company, which is based in Cambridge in the US. Chris is a co-founder of Open Pharma and has led the industry in many transparency initiatives. Under his leadership, Shire, which is now part of Takeda, became the first company to mandate open access. Well done, Chris. That was a great achievement for publications from the research it supports. Subsequently, Takeda became the first top 10 pharmaceutical company to require this. Why not the other 9, we wonder. Chris continues to explore how to further improve transparency through initiatives such as the plain language summaries, layered publication and preprints. Chris.
Thank you, Richard. I didn't put hero in my own bio there. I have to acknowledge that. But thank you, Richard. So much of what I'm going to say is in that condensed bio that Richard just gave you. But I'm very happy to be here today. I work in Takeda Global Medical Affairs, and one of the areas that I'm responsible for is global publications of Takeda's research. What is open access? Well, I think you heard it very eloquently there. Open access is the ability to access information on demand online without any kind of paywall. So we've taken a pragmatic approach that the various license combinations and the various license restrictions, we chose to be pragmatic and say that we'll embrace open access as the entirety at the moment. Our goal is to have everything what you might call full open access with a CC BY license without any embargo, but we're on a bit of a journey here. We accepted to take a journey towards CC BY full open access as the ultimate goal. You heard very eloquently from our patient speaker, Richard, there a moment ago, that it's all about transparency. It's all about getting access to the latest literature and research for healthcare professionals and increasingly patients as well. And we don't want the patients or
healthcare professionals who are not in academic institutions or not in large teaching hospitals. We want everybody to be able to access our research immediately and to be able to help them get a diagnosis for their patient, do further research to improve access to medicines or improve patient care. And for Takeda, as rare diseases is a major part of our focus area, and the diagnostic journey for rare disease patients really is quite a trauma. The statistics that say the average rare disease patient takes 7 to 8 years for them to actually get an accurate diagnosis. I was talking to Richard beforehand, actually, and the first diagnosis could be quite quick, but actually getting to a correct diagnosis takes a heck of a long time with patients with rare diseases. And we believe that having access to literature freely and in a timely manner should help that diagnostic journey for rare disease patients. For Takeda, it's very much aligned with our 4 pillars of the acronym PTRB. It's putting patients at the heart and the center of everything that we do. We want to build trust with society, both our customers and society as a whole. We want to reinforce the reputation of Takeda, but also the pharmaceutical industry as well. And I think Open Pharma is definitely geared towards that. And then finally, we believe it's good for business. So there's definitely a mind shift. On the left-hand side here, you'll see the various non-profit organizations that have already mandated open access. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, European Union, etc., etc. And on the other side, you'll see some of the other funders there, the NIH, US Department of Defense, etc. You may have heard in the past week or so that the White House, President Biden, declared that all US federally funded research needed to be open access, and interestingly, immediate open access by 2026. So I think, as with many of these federal proclamations, we don't know how that's going to happen yet, but clearly that's an interesting development from the US perspective. So it was actually Wellcome played a very large part in us becoming the first company to mandate open access back in 2018. Richard was at the same meeting that I was, and one of the leaders of the Wellcome Trust's research portfolio, Robert Kiley, challenged me and other pharma people who were at that meeting and said, "You fund 2/3, you're the major funder, you fund 2/3 of the world's clinical research. Why aren't you taking a stand on this?" And that was my light bulb moment of being in that room thinking, why don't we? And so I went back to Shire and began the process of making that happen. And so about a year later, because things don't move very quickly in pharma, but about a year later, we became the first company to mandate open access from all our supported research. So what I was asked to do today is focus a bit on how we made that happen. And I can talk you through that. So Takeda acquired Shire in 2019. And then we began the journey of, well, how do we take this from a medium-sized company to what was, at the time and still is, a top 10 pharma company. So Takeda already had a commitment to data transparency for clinical trials, but hadn't taken that additional step of mandating that supported research was open access. So we had a foundation, we had the Shire Foundation as well, of allowing research requests and access to patient-level data, but it was getting those conversations going and getting a comfort level within the company that we needed to do to bring Takeda along as well. Fortunately, after another couple of years, we managed to get Takeda to make that commitment and become the first top 10 pharma to mandate open access, to have an open access commitment to all its supported research. So how do you do that? Well, I think the first thing was recognizing that pharma is a major funder of clinical research in particular, and that we do have a voice here. Pharma often takes a very conservative approach, waits to see what happens, is not necessarily a leader, but we decided to take the bold step of being a leader here and using the position of funding the majority of the world's clinical research to make something happen. I think also, in my own mind, it was realizing that researchers are always restricted in some way, either by their own institution or by the NIH or by Wellcome, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There's always a requirement there. So why would it be any different if people wanted to take our research funding, our resources? Why couldn't we put a requirement on there? And we didn't believe it was an onerous requirement. We believed it was the right thing to do. And it's basically, if you want to work with us, if you want to do research for us or accept research funds, we require you to publish the results of that research open access. As I mentioned before, Takeda has 4 broad principles for our business, and we believe that it's aligned with those. And obviously, there's an internal process that you've got to go through, getting everybody comfortable. And so making sure that the various components, the medical organization, the R&D organization, there's always legal and compliance these days, as those of you in corporations will know, and our commercial business units as well, making sure that everybody came along with us on this journey. One of the key things is that we did this as a no surprises approach. So before anybody works with us, and obviously we put agreements in place, and we just incorporated the open access requirement into all these agreements. So if you're going to participate in a clinical trial for us as an investigator, the investigator agreement states that, and states that we will publish the results of this clinical study in an open access vehicle. If you want research funds from us, from a program we call investigator-initiated research, we're happy to do that if the research aligns with our areas of interest, of course. But again, our requirement is that you publish the results of that research in an open access vehicle. We also made sure that budget was available from my department if people needed to fund the open access requirement. So if a journal was charging an open access fee, we'd make sure that there was funding available to do that. And then, of course, internal training and alignment within the company to make sure that a broad 55,000 person, 87 country organization understood what requirements we had and how to do it. As I said, I think the other thing, as I said earlier, the other success factor here was taking a pragmatic approach to open access, that we had to start somewhere. And so we chose to take what we could now and work towards the ultimate goal of immediate open access with a CC-BY license as the future goal. Some barriers. Well, we did some research back in 2018 when we became the first company to do open access, and only about 20% of journals at that time allow CC-BY for the pharmaceutical industry. It's a higher figure for the broader universe of people submitting to journals, and it's certainly higher for academia. And one of the questions we would ask there is why. On the positive side, though, at least 3/4 of publishers offered some kind of open access to pharma. But again, we'd ask why the other quarter isn't doing that. Within Takeda, within any pharmaceutical company, I think there's some legacy thinking. I think there was, when open access first came on the scene several years ago, there was a feeling that it was inferior, that it's not one of the high impact factor journals, and we had to overcome that as just a general legacy thought process within the company. And one of the other big things to overcome was author freedom. But as I mentioned before, if you put it in terms of authors, investigators are used to having restrictions placed on their research funding, and as long as we're very open and transparent about that, then it really hasn't been an issue. There's also legacy contracts that we might have didn't stipulate it. We have contracts going back multiple years, and so we've allowed those to be grandfathered in, essentially. We'd encourage open access, but we can't mandate it. It's too difficult to go back and change all those contracts. And then we do have some challenges with specific geographies like China. So in summary, back in 2018, Shire became the first pharma company to, actually, if I'm allowed to say this, we became the first commercial company to mandate open access publication, whether a pharmaceutical company or not. We ended up with an enthusiastic adoption of open access within Shire, and thankfully that carried over to Takeda. I would say that stakeholder engagement and planning and making sure that there's a no surprises approach are key to the success. I'm very pleased to say that we've had 2 years of successful open access policy at Takeda as well.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's a great achievement. I mean, it's wonderful. That, I'm sure many other people in this room have had a light bulb moment. I heard Mark Walpert, who was the director of Wellcome, describe his light bulb moment when he went looking for a piece of research they'd published and discovered he had to pay $35 in order to access it. And that infuriated him so much that he moved towards open access, and Wellcome have been leaders since the very beginning. So now we're going to hear from Leila more about what is the role and value of open access publishing in communicating pharma research. Leila is a director of open access policy at Wiley, where she's responsible for the development of Wiley's open access policies. She's been working in academic publishing since 2007. She's a member of the Research for Life Capacity Development Committee and has a keen interest in increasing awareness of the benefits of open research. Leila.
So, hi, thank you very much for inviting me to talk here today. I want to make it clear I'm not an expert in pharma publishing, but hopefully you'll be reassured to know that I do know a lot about open research practices and the way that publishers can help to bring value and help to open up not only access to research results, but also how they make the research process more transparent and in turn hopefully help to build trust. So at Wiley, we have a robust portfolio of journals in the health sciences. We have 456 health science titles, and 112 of these are gold open access journals. A further 318 offer OA publishing options. These can also be known as hybrid journals. We publish over 2,500 pharma-sponsored papers in our journals each year, but at the moment only a small proportion of these are published as open access. We do know that there is much more work to do to ensure that authors are aware of the benefits associated with open access publishing. And this is certainly not something that's specific to pharma-sponsored publishing. This is something that's true across all research areas. So as a way of trying to help increase the awareness of the benefits of open access publishing at Wiley, we analysed over 365,000 articles over a period of 4 years to discover whether there is an advantage to publishing open access. So what we did discover was that on average, OA articles were downloaded 3 times more than subscription articles. Open access articles were cited 50% more than subscription articles, and open access articles received nearly 3 times as much altmetric attention as subscription articles. So, as well as educating researchers about the benefits of open access publishing, we're also working to ensure that as many researchers as possible are able to choose open access publishing. At Wiley, we've signed a number of transformational agreements that enable thousands of researchers across the globe to publish open access in Wiley journals. We also have open access agreements with a number of key organisations, which include funders and pharma companies. These agreements ensure that researchers associated with these organisations are able to publish open access in our journals. Additionally, we're working with organisations such as Research for Life to ensure that open access publishing is equitable, and we offer waivers and discounts to authors from low and lower middle income economies. We're also committed to trying to make the research publishing process more transparent. Recently, Wiley signed DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment, to make evident our commitment to improving visibility around the research publishing process and improving the visibility of the impact of the research that we publish. This will include sharing information such as peer review times and article downloads, which will provide greater transparency around journal performance and article level performance. This level of transparency is increasingly important in an OA world. So being more transparent about the publishing process can also help to tackle issues around trust and research integrity. And we're supporting this at Wiley by offering a number of different options beyond open access across our journal portfolio. Open data is increasingly becoming a hot topic. Opening up access to research data can help to improve trust in the research process. It increases opportunities for reproducibility and minimises duplication. 93% of Wiley's health science titles have data availability policies. We believe that research data is as important as the published article. When data is fair, which is findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, the research process becomes more efficient, as you can access and analyse others' findings and reuse data to inform new findings. 7% of Wiley's health science titles that have data sharing policies in place also offer transparent peer review, which in combination enable even greater transparency around the research and publication process. At present, we have over 70 journals across our entire portfolio that have adopted the transparent peer review. But it's interesting to note that so far, 86% of authors remain opted into transparent peer review, and there are no negative effects on journal turnaround times, which means that there is an appetite for things like transparent peer review, but there's much more work to do to increase engagement. We also offer a number of other open research practices that help improve transparency and trust across the research process. Registered reports shift the emphasis of peer review away from the final outcomes of a study and onto the integrity and transparency of the study design and reporting, reducing factors that contribute to publication bias and other practices that get in the way of transparency and reproducibility. ORCID is a simple thing that provides researchers with their own persistent digital identifier. And things like credit allow for a standardised description of each researcher's contribution to an article. This fits Wiley's open research mission by increasing transparency about who participated in the research and acknowledgement of the role they played. Credit can be used in innovative ways, for example, by showing who has contributed specific expertise to an article. We believe that open research provides so many benefits, and it isn't something that might happen in the future. It's the here and the now. We know that there's more work to be done to fully embed open research practices into the research process, so that researchers are incentivized to make more outputs open and transparent. Publishers can support this mission by providing education around the benefits of open research and by developing the tools and infrastructure to enable more authors to make their research as open and reusable as possible, which will in turn help to solve some of the world's most complex and challenging issues. Thank you very much.
Richard, can you come and sit up here? Good, well, thank you very much. Now we've almost caught up, which I think is pretty impressive of these speakers. So we've now got time for questions and comments. And actually, I'd like to kick us off. I understand why you might want to stand up, because I know whether people at the back can see you. But sit down for now, and you could jump up when you speak. So I suppose let me ask the first question of all three of you. I remember talking to the meeting of STM publishers in Frankfurt in the mid-90s, so this is the 1990s, as the internet had appeared, and say, we didn't use the word open access then, but everything would have to change. Why is it so slow? I mean, here we are 25 years later. So let me ask each of you to comment on that, and then we'll move to the audience. Richard.
I don't know. From the perspective of patients who are involved in research, it actually hasn't been that slow, because the progress in delivering open access publication has actually, I think, gone along with patients being involved in research. Year 2000, there weren't that many of us doing it. I mean, certainly in cancer in the UK, there were 22 of us, and we all knew each other. It's now over 2,000 people at various levels. Same in Europe, and similar, not quite the same, but similar in the USA, because they had the patient activists in HIV research. So there's a tradition of it there. So I don't know why it has taken so long, but as a patient, my immediate response is, actually, compared to many other things in the world, it doesn't seem that long. But it's definitely the coming trend, and as I said earlier, sooner or later it's going to sweep everything else aside. Open access is the future. It's coming. You lot will make it happen. More power to your elbows.
Oh, an inspiring speech. Chris, and let's talk specifically with you about the pharmaceutical industry. Why is it going even more slowly than the broader academic community?
I think it's ingrained mentalities. I think there was a fear initially from pharma that open access we would lose control of everything, that our data would be out there, people would be able to manipulate it. bad things would happen. And so I think that's one side of things. The other side is that I think we were afraid of what the reaction would be from our authors, from our investigators. And as I said before, I think we figured out how to manage that, but I think it's fear. I think it's fear, basically, and those fears are unfounded, as we've said, and we'll try and speed things along from this point.
But I mean, you've done it, but lots of other companies have not followed you. I mean, you've shown that it can be done, that the Earth doesn't collapse. Why are they not following?
Again, I think it's these are large battleships that take a long time to turn. One of the reasons we were able to do it at Shire was a small to medium-sized company at the time, and so there's less politics, there's less infrastructure, less people to convince. But some of these organisations, the largest pharma are 85,000 people, something like that. That's a big organisation to change a mindset in.
So was it a problem persuading Takeda to adopt the policy?
We had to go back to square one. So we had to go back with the advocacy, the internal advocacy, and explaining how we did it at Shire, how it could happen at Takeda, and that took another 18 months to do. So I wouldn't say it was difficult, but we knew the steps to go through from the Shire experience, definitely, and we brought Takeda along more quickly because of that. So happy to help other pharma.
So do you speak to other companies, and do they say, yes, we must do this too, or what?
We have other companies within Open Pharma, as you know, and there's other companies that are moving along the road to an open access commitment, but they're not quite there yet, either because of gaining internal alignment on it, or some companies believe that they don't need it. They'll show you figures that they're already at 75% of their articles published in open access journals. So obviously we think that you need to go for 100%, and that you should mandate that to make it clear to the people that you're working with that the research will be published in open access journals.
Thanks. Why is it so slow?
Yeah, I agree with all of the comments so far. I think it is fear. It's trying to change anyone's mindset is a slow and difficult process. I think a lot more work needs to be done on the advocacy side of things, so talking about the benefits of open access, and actually trust and integrity piece is hugely important, and I think talking about all of those benefits that open access can bring will really help to change that mindset. But I do also think mandates are the things that really drive it forward, because you can say we suggest that you do this, or it's a really good idea, but I think until mandates are in place, we're not going to see a more rapid change and move towards open access.
Good, thanks. Right, questions, comments. So let us know who you are. There we are. Bold man's going to ask the first question. And then they'll come in a torrent, is the usual experience.
Hi, my name is Kaveh from River Valley Technologies. So firstly, congratulations to Chris for being a first commercial company. I understand that mandating open access. But I have several points, but I'll stick to one. If we have suppose you have open access, and the patients, supposing I'm a patient and I try to see what's going on, it's actually very difficult to read. It's all gobbledygook. It's all very technical language. You mentioned the sort of plain language summaries, which would make it easier. But the point I'd like to make is, I'm a physicist myself. My background is physics. And I've written a few papers. And I remember when you write the paper, you're sort of tempted to write it as you read it. If it's a couple of short sentences, you actually combine it into one long sentence, which is unreadable with passive voice. Because that's the way scientists write, that's the way you are. So you write it in an unreadable way for reasons that I still don't understand after 30 years. So my point is, it would be nice to encourage scientists to write as they're talking to their grandmothers or grandfathers. Yes. So that we don't then have to go back and reverse engineer and write what have we called it?
Plain language
Plain
summaries,
language
yeah.
summaries. Let's talk in plain language to start with.
Right. So, Richard,
Yes.
why you answer that question?
Well, that's the next revolution, but one at a time, I think. Let's have the open access stuff first. See, I think you're absolutely right, and I've never understood why scientists are really amazingly brilliant people, and as we saw on one of your slides, doing wonderful, fantastic things, and yet when they write about it, they make it as boring as heck. Why do you do that? I don't know. But so, yes, you're right, but we're not there yet. One of the reasons patients get involved in research, because we've talked about patients searching for information for their own treatment, but one of the reasons we get involved in research generally is to benefit other patients. We want good news. We want evidence that changes clinical practice. So to a certain extent, we have been shoehorned into the existing system, which is often academic kudos from certain journals. And it is Royal Colleges waiting 5 years to review all the evidence across whole things. So there is a difference between individual patients and patient involvement. And I think you're right. I think the way papers are written, abstracts are written, will change, but that's a gradual process. And I genuinely think, yes, you're right, it can't come soon enough, but actually one thing at a time. And speaking personally, what interests me more is getting patients access to the information that I need for my treatment and that you may need for your treatment or the person you care about. That's the first step. And then after the break, I understand that we are going to be talking about plain language summaries, or as I would prefer, plain English summaries, because what's plain language to one person is not the same as what's plain language to another. They are introduce a whole different
Well
topic.
done. Yeah, so Michael O'Donnell, the great editor of World Medicine, used to talk about papers being written in decorated municipal Gothic, which I think was a good description of academic writing. I don't know why it has to be that way. Down at the back there.
Thank you. I'm Tony O'Rourke from Crimson Interactive and Argo. We're a comms business. Nobody's mentioned preprints yet. I realise we've not had much time. But what influence or how influential are preprints in your thinking? And do you see them as replacing journals at some point down the line?
Let me ask you that, Chris, first. Preprints. So are you getting into preprints? I mean, it is happening very, very fast now.
So, a great question, thank you. And we've struggled with preprints as well for many, many years. Open Pharma is trying to address where preprints fit into the publication of pharmaceutical research. At Takeda at the moment, we are looking at how we would pilot using preprints, and I think it's fair to say at the moment we're looking at preclinical research only. With preprints, there is the fear that we really are putting our research out there into the great unknown. And I think we'll get there eventually, but we're still in the early days of deciding what kinds of pharmaceutical research we would be willing to put out into the preprint world, where, I mean, there really is no boundaries, right? I mean, you could get comments from absolutely anybody, positive, negative, maybe there's a conflict of interest there and we just wouldn't know. So there's definitely a level of discomfort in doing it for clinical research at the moment, but we are looking at it for other types of research.
Do you want to say something about preprints, Leila?
See, I've debated whether to include preprints in our list of open research practices. I think it's a difficult one in this area in particular, because I know sort of during the COVID crisis, there were all kinds of things out there available, and the public were reading everything and taking it as gospel, as peer-reviewed, it's, you know, and proven research. So I think there is that worry in terms of preprints, but I also think there is value to preprints and sharing results early on in the process. But I think it's important that it remains linked to a peer-reviewed version, to the data, to all of the outputs, and I think there's real value in trying to work out how we link up all of these different outputs. I think a preprint out there on its own in existence maybe I have some concerns around that, but I think if we can link it to the peer review and open up the peer review and open up the methods and all of those kind of things, it could have real value.
Yeah, it assumes that the existing peer review models are not fit for purpose. in that, preprints can survive very effectively using forms of sort of collaborative post-publication or post-appearance review. And then the good papers will float to the top and it will become very quickly known. Isn't that likely to be the case in clinical, in medicine?
And we also offer some of our preprints. We offer peer review of the preprints, and these are open peer reviews as well. So yeah, I mean, things could certainly change, and I'm not saying that things are perfect as they stand, absolutely not. And I think things are evolving more rapidly now as we're starting to see people become more interested in preprints and opening up other parts of the research process. So I think it's evolving, and I think it will change.
Does Wiley have a preprint server, or what's your policy on preprints?
We do. So we have part of Wiley is Authoria, which is a preprint server, and we offer peer review of the preprints, and we also can link that up to if the paper goes on to be published in a journal, then we can link up those different versions so that they're all connected along the way.
I mean, as you probably know, I mean, in high-energy physics and maths, it's been the norm way before the internet even appeared. And it's come much later to medical publishing. I mean, we actually at the BMJ, we tried a preprint server in the 1990s, and it was just far too early. But now medRxiv is beginning to increase exponentially like the others. Right, over there at the back.
Thanks. I'm Lisa Sullivan from Novo Nordisk. I just wanted to ask about the preprint server. GPP 2022 just published last week essentially said that they don't recommend use of preprints as part of your regular publication planning. They say that since they're generally not peer-reviewed, it shouldn't be something.
And GPP is good.
Good publication practices.
And comes from who?
So it's been adopted by a group called the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals, who authored it. It was released about 2 weeks ago. But it is interesting that they've adopted that position.
Yeah.
It is interesting, yeah. Right. Do you want to say anything about that? The GPP not recommending preprints? Because, most publishers seem to be quite open to preprints, and it doesn't stop you subsequently publishing in the journal. So, I mean, if they're going to have any influence, it's going to reverse a trend that's well underway.
They basically say that if it's to be done, it needs to meet the same rigor as any other. Preprint should meet the same standards for rigor, completeness, and ethics as a peer-reviewed publication. So I think it goes with what Leila was saying.
Well, that's a bit different from saying don't use a preprint, isn't it? It's just saying, right. Here?
Hi, yeah, Alex from the Microbiology Society. Chris, I think you put up on one of your slides a really interesting point. I think you said only 20% of journals allow CCBY for pharma papers, but then 3/4 offer OA. That is a really interesting piece of information for me. I as a publisher, we don't ever look at that kind of thing and prevent and say you have to publish under a different license. Are there checks that are being done and that you are, authors are being prevented and contacted? What's going on there?
When we publish something now, because of the mandate, we obviously ask for, we start at the top and we ask for, we say that we want to publish this article with OA, with a CCBY license. And depending on the publisher, we get offered either OA with CCBY 20% of the time, or we get offered something else. Most typically, it's the non-commercial, non-derivative, so CCBY and CND. We accept that at the moment because, as I said, we're taking a pragmatic approach. We would like ultimately to be able to work towards the CCBY for all our articles, all our manuscripts. And I think from the publisher's point of view, there's still this lingering fear that we're going to use OA CCBY for commercial purposes, but of course we're not. We just would never do that. And if we use reprints or if we use figures or articles or whatever, and there's a license fee to be paid, then obviously we'd still pay that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Do you want to say something about this? Do you allow CCBY for pharmaceutical companies?
So we don't have restrictions specifically for pharmaceutical companies, but there are certain journals where we don't allow CCBY, and lots of these are legacy agreements, and some societies have decided maybe they're not going to do that. But I think that's changing, and I think the perception of what CCBY allows actually is changing, and it's becoming more, as I mentioned before, we have transformational agreements in place, which can be sort of national agreements, and sometimes as part of those, actually, we decide the CCBY is going to be available to everybody within that. So it's definitely changing, where we're moving towards being more open to allowing CCBY across the portfolio, but it's we're not quite there yet. But in terms of individual pharma companies, I mean, if you have a mandate in place, we normally would say that's fine, we will follow. If that's your mandate and you want to publish with us, then it's not often where we would say you can't.
So it's not Wiley that has a policy, it's the individual journals?
Yeah, so it'll be individual journals. So our policy at Wiley, is that the majority of our journals will allow CCBY across the board, and our Gold OA journals in particular.
Okay, we'll have one more question then. Yeah, do you want to...
Typical patient question, what's CCBY?
I mean, in essence, it means a license. You can do absolutely anything you want with it, including using it for commercial purposes, anything. And the reason I tell you that journals don't like it is because they have made a massive amount of money out of reprints, and they worry that they could lose that. I mean, I think a lot of these things come down to money, as they do everywhere in the world. So it's a shame that it's not possible because usually it's not a barrier to individual researchers who are not linked with pharma. Well, it isn't to pharmaceutical companies.
So as we think of it, it's sharing good news.
In a complete way, because there are degrees of open access. I mean, just being free to read it is not really open access. Open access is being able to take it and reuse it for anything you want, simply by citing the original source. Right, one more question, and then we'll move on. Here.
Hello, good day, everyone. Tash here from TrendMD. I'm not sure who my question is directed towards, but it's connected with legacy thinking and the closed access when we think of Nature or we think of Science and those prestigious journals. And the question, I think, when we think about the top 10 pharma companies, the other 9, why is it that they're not following the trend of open access? Could it be, I guess my question is, what is the level of influence, do we think, or do we believe that the legacy journals wanting to publish in the so-called top-tier journal, what level of impact this has on their decisions in not wanting to go open access for a journal that might not be known or that's new?
I think we'll get them all to say something. So legacy thinking, you introduced the term. I mean, legacy thinking in my mind is dinosaur thinking. I think it's polite. Legacy thinking is a polite word.
So I think many people in pharma have come from academia, and I think there is definitely still the thought that you need to publish in the journals with the highest impact factors. So I think something we haven't addressed is taking thinking away from how do you choose your journal, and I would like to see us move away from that and begin to incorporate some of the data that Leila shared around how accessible it is, what alt metrics are you getting, et cetera, but there's still a very legacy mindset that you've got to go for the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, interestingly enough, within Takeda, we could choose the New England Journal of Medicine because we took a pragmatic approach to our definition of open access. The only journal we can't submit to at the moment by our own policy is The Lancet.
Right. Leila, would you like to answer this question? And then I'll leave the last word to you, Richard, as the patient rep.
I do think there is still some of that thinking that you want to publish in the most prestigious journal with the highest impact factor. But I also think that mindset is maybe starting to change, and actually people are moving away from just thinking about the name of the journal. And that's why we're trying to be more open about article level data, so talking about the impact of specific articles rather than where that article is published and having sort of that overall picture. So I think it's going to become more important, maybe looking at speed of publication or how good the peer review process is or how many citations papers normally get on average. And I think maybe we'll start looking at other metrics and authors be able to make decisions based on more facts rather than just the legacy of a journal that's in existence.
Richard.
Really interesting question, actually, legacy data. I liked your analogy, dinosaur data, because I was thinking cave paintings. You know, we found the caves, we found the paintings, Dead Sea Scrolls, we found them. Samuel Pepys's diary. You know, we find this stuff. It does exist. I think the word legacy is the key. You know, eventually, the legacy disappears and everybody moves on. I mean, for goodness sake, the past few days in this country, that's actually what the discussion has been all about. The legacy is there. We move on. There is a new monarch. We have a new king. We move on. Sooner or later, we will move on. And we patients will be pushing it to move on a little further and a little faster.
Good. Well, can we give these three speakers a round of applause? There'll be a chance for you to come back at the end. Let's move on to the second session, which is around accessible summaries of published research. We're going to begin with Adeline Rosenberg talking about audiences and usage of plain language summaries. So Adeline is a senior medical writer and plain language writing specialist within Oxford PharmaGenesis patient engagement team, and was a co-author of the Open Pharma recommendations for plain language summaries, which I'm sure you've all read. She's also a rare disease patient advocate and steering committee patient partner of the Oxford Patient Engagement Network for arthritis and musculoskeletal conditions at the University of Oxford. So wearing, in a sense, two hats.
So I'm here today speaking on audiences and usage of plain language summaries. So essentially the who and the how, who is using plain language summaries and what are they doing with them. So a really good point that was raised in the previous Q&A is that scientific technical writing is boring and difficult to understand. And so in that vein, plain language actually benefits everyone, so experts and non-experts alike. And starting here from a sort of a general scientific perspective, and I'll move on to the more medical and health perspective shortly. But plain language benefits everyone. It aids comprehension, it aids digestion of reading. So, you know, when we're talking about plain language, we're talking about the public, the media, policymakers, you know, as all potential target audiences for plain language summaries. And a really nice quote here from Brian Southwell for the publication plan, speaking on the context of misinformation in the pandemic. But he, you know, says here that people are turning to information that is convenient, accessible, and ubiquitous. And these are, you know, really the key concepts of information that people are turning to. And in this case, it happened to be misinformation. But that, you know, as scientific professionals, we need to be providing the true and accurate information within these same concepts as in a way that serves the needs of readers to be convenient, accessible, and ubiquitous. So then more specifically in the biomedical and health context, you know, this target audience can expand to include patients and caregivers and, you know, support networks, family and friends, patient advocacy organisations and charities, and really quite crucially as well, healthcare professionals. You know, they may be non-specialists, they may be time poor and have just, you know, minutes between appointments to catch up on the literature. But the point is plain language really is for everyone. And to put a few numbers to this, in one survey, you know, patients actually ranked scientific journals as their third most important source of online health-related information. And for the clinicians, 46%, I wrote these numbers are very small, but it says 46% of the clinicians considered plain language summaries to be valuable, and 60% indicated they would use plain language summaries to inform patient dialogue. So, you know, what this really means is that plain language, you know, as a form of discussion, and plain language summaries as a tool, enables these types of informed discussions between different stakeholders from an equitable platform. It allows them to engage with each other. So, you know, really quite simply, if we're saying that plain language is for everyone, and again, a nice quote here from David Schley from Sense About Science, is that we have a better chance of having a well-informed public making critical decisions if they've got access to plain language summaries. And a lot of us are here from biomedical and health backgrounds, but this is, you know, this is true for climate policy as well as health policy. Anywhere where we're asking people to make decisions, whether at a policy level or in the clinic, plain language is helping everyone. So in light of this, plain language summaries in journal publications are coming in many different formats, from infographics to text-based to podcasts, which I'm sure Caroline will speak to you later, videos, and even standalone, articles themselves. So going to focus a little bit here on the text-based summaries, which we're pulling out because these can be indexed on PubMed. And why we're focusing on PubMed, it's harking back to that, the accessibility, the ubiquitousness, and the convenience. When we think of how are people finding research information online, they may not know, I need to go to this journal because that's where it was published. They go to an indexing tool, and PubMed is one of the most accessible and most widely used ones. So again, just some numbers to show this. They have over 2.5 million daily users, and these are users from all sorts of different backgrounds. Yes, the majority are, fellow researchers and healthcare professionals, but there's also students, patients and support networks are accessing PubMed as well, and also librarians and information professionals and educators and trainers who are taking this information and then sharing it with their own networks beyond PubMed. So ensuring that plain language summaries are meeting the requirements of PubMed to be indexed in this way is really important for helping make sure that they are found and discovered by the people who need to use them. So last year, the Open Pharma collaboration worked together with our members and supporters and many other key advisors on an expert roundtable and focused public consultation to develop our recommendations for what we think good quality plain language summaries should look like. It's not official guidance in any way, it's simply our recommendations. And this was published in last September, I think a year ago yesterday actually, in Current Medical Research and Opinion. There's a link in QR code there to read it. But just to summarise that, we have the infographic from that article, which again I realise is a little hard to read on the screen. But these are our sort of 10 key points of what we believe as a sort of foundational standard or minimum standard of a good plain language summary. So first of all, very obviously, written in understandable language. It needs to be written for a broad audience, not using technical jargon and all that boring stuff. As a sort of minimum foundation, it ideally needs to be text-based so that it can go on PubMed and it can be used more broadly. But then from there, this is only a foundation. Then consider doing the infographics and the videos and all these different types of formats that meet different learning styles and serve different audiences. And in that same vein, as a start, write for a broad audience, and then as an additional piece, you might consider writing for a more specific target audience, maybe specifically for one patient community or another. The content within plain language summaries needs to be consistent with the scientific conclusions. We can't really be, drawing new conclusions that weren't there in the paper to begin with. They also need to link to the evidence, so whether that's a clinical trial identifier or a DOI of some kind, because once we're putting information out there on the internet, we can't guarantee what other people are going to do with it. We can't guarantee that it's always going to be presented with the scientific publication. So, in the event that it does get separated from it, we want that evidence and that trail back to the data to be there. In terms of the development process, plain language summaries should really be co-developed with the article itself. This allows, the authors of the article to input on it in line with the ICMG authorship criteria. Plain language summaries need to be user tested. We need to make sure that they're fit for purpose. In some cases, this may mean putting together a patient council to review it, or more simply just asking a non-expert to check that what you've written is comprehensible and understandable. A really crucial piece is peer review. We need to hold plain language summaries to the same standard that we hold journal articles, and so if we're considering that kind of robust piece of journal articles to be the peer review process, plain language summaries need to have that too. And also very crucial, or as we've now said that two are crucial, but they are, is that they absolutely have to be free to read. Preferably in an open access article, but at the very least hosted in front of the paywall alongside the abstract, because a plain language summary behind a paywall is not doing anyone any good. And then, in the same thought process there, and this one's particularly for the publishers, to please tag it with metadata so that it can either be hosted on PubMed or it can be found on Google, just to make sure that people can actually find and discover and read it. Because if it's hidden in the supplementary materials behind a paywall, no one's ever going to read it, and you'll have written it for nothing. So that is a very whirlwind tour through the Open Pharma recommendations. I'd encourage you to read the full document. Please grab me afterwards, happy to talk through it more. And also, we at Open Pharma are running a survey to publishers, so if you are a publisher in the room, there is a survey on your chair. Please fill it out, we will very much appreciate that. We also have business cards with QR codes if you want to take that back to colleagues and such. And we hope to learn more about what the publishers are doing, which I'm sure we will do shortly. Thank you.
We're going to hear about the how, Ipsen's commitment on plain language summaries. So Sarah Thomas is a global medical publications and communications senior manager at Ipsen. She's played a significant role in the implementation of Ipsen's commitment on plain language summaries. Over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak on such an important topic. So I'll be talking about Ipsen's commitment on plain language summaries. So you might be aware that in 2019, Ipsen committed to publishing all of our manuscripts open access so that they'd be accessible to all. And we're aware that patients are looking for information from journals. So a survey carried out by UCB showed that around half of the patients were actively looking for information from journals. So making our publications open access helps patients to access those publications. But is the information truly accessible and is it digestible? So the two graphs on the bottom of this slide here show that the readability of articles has reduced over time because of an increase in use in technical language. So this illustrated the need for us to provide plain language summaries following on from our original open access commitment. So that's some background, and this is the commitment that we've made. So from July of this year, Ipsen commits to publishing as a minimum 250-word plain language summaries for all company-sponsored journal publications that include data from human studies. So this is sort of the minimum standard. It doesn't stop preclinical teams developing plain language summaries. It also wouldn't preclude anyone developing a more complex infographic-based plain language summary either. And so here's a timeline of sort of how it came about. So we'd carried out some benchmarking and a pilot on plain language summaries, and then, as you know, the Open Pharma plain language summary recommendations came out in September 21. So this gave us the framework to be able to make this commitment. So we then took it to ethics and leadership and got approval, and that endorsed. And then we made it public at ISMAP in January 2022 of this year. So prior to that and following on from this, we worked on developing a process for lay review, some internal guidelines for writing and reviewing plain language summaries, a lexicon to develop understandable vocabulary that can be used in different therapy areas to ensure consistency and also to help with the writing process. And then we also developed a form that we use that reviewers can fill out, sort of tick box form when they're reviewing plain language summaries. So we've developed coming up to 50 plain language summaries, I think now, and I can sort of share how we've incorporated that development within our manuscript process. So in most cases, we've incorporated the plain language summaries towards the sort of second half of manuscript development. So that they can be reviewed by authors and internal reviewers along with the manuscript draft. That's important. And then also so that the plain language summary will go for review with the journal and undergo the normal peer review process. So we had planned to establish patient review of the plain language summaries. Setting this up has been quite complicated. I think we're getting there, but we'll hopefully incorporate that hopefully towards the end of this year. But we've had some complexities with setting that up. So as an interim measure for review, we've asked 2 team members who were not familiar with the therapy area to review each plain language summary. And we now have a larger group of internal lay reviewers who volunteered to review our plain language summaries, and they're from functions outside of medical affairs. They're not in R&D, they're not in commercial, they're not in HOR, and they review by filling in this form that we've developed to tell us if it's understandable, and then we can then make amends with the authors following on from that. And so we try and ask for a minimum of two lay reviewers, but sometimes we'll have more than that as well.
Okay. So we'll be really happy to share our learnings as we progress through the process, but I thought it might be interesting just to show highlight some of our next steps that we're thinking about now. So we plan to develop formal SOPs for plain language summary development. Our patient centricity team, as I mentioned, are working really hard to set up patient expert review panels. So then the patients would take over that lay review instead of our internal lay reviews that we have at the moment. We plan to keep reviewing our lexicon. So, for example, we'll need to update the vocabulary as we learn more. You know, we know now we need to incorporate some more health economics terms within our lexicon that we use. And then we want to look at ways of how to improve accessibility and discoverability. So, you know, would translating plain language summaries be useful? If so, in what languages, and where would we then house them? And then how we can work with journals better to ensure that the plain language summaries will be indexed. And then we'd also be keen to look at some sort of metrics to see, you know, how impactful the plain language summaries are as well. So that's just a very brief overview of where we've got to so far. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So did I understand all that stuff you've developed, you're willing to share it, or it's proprietary?
The guidelines, so it's internal at the moment.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, we're looking to share our knowledge. Yeah.
Right, well, that was the how. Now we're moving on to the where, accessible summaries at Springer Nature. We're going to hear from Caroline Halford, who's the Development Director for Medical Education at Springer Healthcare. The majority of Caroline's career at Springer has been within the ADIS journal group, developing and launching their open access medical journal portfolio. Her key focus at ADIS was ensuring that each article is digestible to as wide an audience as possible through innovations such as plain language summaries and digital enhancements such as video abstracts and infographics, just the beginning of the new world. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to Open Pharma for inviting me here today. So yeah, I'm Caroline Halford, and yeah, as Richard mentioned, most of my career at Springer Nature has been with the ADIS journals, but now I've got a broader focus, so I'm hopefully going to bring some insights on Springer Nature as well. So this first slide is a whistle-stop tour of Springer Nature's accessible summary history. We've actually been open to publishing accessible summaries at Springer Nature for quite some time. We published our first one in an emergency medicine journal in 2006, but the next one wasn't published till 2009. So I think it's fair to say that uptake has been slow. But it was in 2017 that we really saw a huge uptake, an upswing in interest in plain language summaries and accessible summaries. And we saw submissions in these increase across the whole of the Springer Nature portfolio, from Biomed Central, Springer, and Nature. In fact, at this time, a couple of BMC journals decided to mandate accessible summaries with every single article. As a response to that demand, ADIS decided to change its instructions for authors and encourage plain language summaries with every submission. And it was in 2017 that Nature launched its infographical summary articles. They're published in the Nature Weekly Journal, and it's articles typed such as This Week in Science in infographic format. So they'll take the 5 key stories from Science in that week and represent them in infographical format. Last year, we saw a huge leap. I think, from my personal perspective, I think connected with the pandemic, we saw a huge leap in accessible summaries submitted to ADIS journals, where we went from publishing a mere 8 in 2017, when we started to encourage them, up to 151 across the ADIS portfolio last year. And ADIS is such a small part of Springer Nature, that's been quite a leap. The Nature Journal I also launched infographic article types. So the entire article is an accessible infographic of, for example, a clinical trial. And there are several Biomed Central titles launched video summaries as standard across its article So as part of the article processing charge, that authors will get like a 1-minute video bite, really for a lay audience to understand the data. Now I've moved over into a broader Springer Nature role, I can see that the demand for accessible plain language content is rising, such as accessible versions of articles, clinical trials, and clinical guidance in lots of formats, including like text, infographic, videos, and podcasts. So, speaking mostly from the ADIS perspective, but also from Springer Nature as well, the motivations for accessible summaries really resonate with everything that Adeline was saying in your presentation. Firstly, to increase comprehension of science. As we all know, experts are increasingly time poor. There's so much information overload that anything that's going to help give a bite-sized, clear digest of a publication as a snapshot is going to be useful. But also to reduce misunderstanding. And this is really linked to the open access part of accessible summaries, that in today's era of open access, increasing different types of audiences reading articles, and with, since the pandemic as well, increase in press reporting of clinical data, tools that can help ensure that complex data is not misinterpreted and not misunderstood are important. Also, to facilitate sharing of contents, we know from our social media research at Springer Nature that articles with like infographics or plain language content, when shared by authors on social media, really does help to bring extra readership to the articles. And that's something as publishers that we are very passionate about doing. But also lastly, from talking to healthcare professionals, we also understand that patients are increasingly going to their doctors. They're Googling their disorder, they're Googling clinical trials, they've got printouts of these that they take to their GPs. And so we're seeing accessible summaries as like bridging that gap in understanding, hopefully giving healthcare professionals the tools and the right language to discuss clinical data or disorders with patients. Certainly from research that we've seen so far, accessible summaries are beneficial. ADIS presented data at ISMAP in January this year where we looked at all the plain language summary, text plain language summaries that we published at ADIS over the last year. And we found across the board articles with plain language summaries are downloaded more than those without. And there was also an interesting study by Breadbinner and Simon published in PLOS One in 2019 that showed that from both audiences from science backgrounds and non-science backgrounds, plain language summaries and video abstracts help increase comprehension of data. So the lessons learned, it has been a journey, as I'm sure all the other presenters would agree from their perspectives. So the key learnings that I've seen is that there is no one-size-fits-all, and I know, Adeline, you really referenced this perfectly. From our experience in publishing plain language summaries, we're finding that for some, a plain language summary will be too simple, for others it'll be too complex. So our advice is to try and tailor the content to the audience is optimal. An infographic will be great for some, but others might prefer audio slides. And from the plain language summaries that we've seen submitted, we're seeing it's really difficult it's harder than we thought it would be to write in accessible terms. So I think that's improving, but when we put plain language summaries through like the Flesch-Kincaid readability checks, there is still a real variation in levels of understanding. But also what we found is discoverability is key. So linking to the previous presentations, if you're going to write an accessible summary, then open access is going to be really important to help it reach the right audiences. PubMed was a challenge, I'll be honest. When we first started publishing plain language summaries, we assumed that they'd go straight onto PubMed. That wasn't the case. It took a lot of conversations with PubMed to get them included in the indexed summary there, but it was worth it because, as Adeline mentioned, it does make it more accessible. Most people, including doctors, now use Google rather than PubMed. So having the plain language summary on PubMed means that it's more findable, full text, and accessible. Linking back to what I was saying about increasing discoverability of science, if you have, for example, an infographic, plain language summary, using social media with an image really does help extend the reach. Articles that are tweeted out with a graphic get 10 times the attention as just text-only tweets from our experience. But also multi-stakeholder engagement, I think, is key to increase the reach. So publishers, we do a lot to help publicise our research, making sure it gets to the right people. But we find that the most effective accessible summaries are disseminated with collaboration from the authors, the sponsor, the publisher, and patient advocacy groups if possible. So thank you so much. That's, looking forward to the panel discussion.
Right, we've got 15 minutes left, so let's have some questions and comments on plain language summaries. And then I'll warn, I think we should end. I'd like to ask all of the speakers, will all of this increase trust in science? Right, here.
Ian Thraneskevich, PLOS, Public Library of Science nowadays. I was curious for anyone who has, well, I'm looking at two people who have been successful in implementing plain language summaries. I think one of the concerns that I hear or have seen coming up is who pays for them? Because for a publisher, obviously the paying customer is often a library or an author, a researcher, if it's open access, but often it's the funder. So I can imagine there's been some challenging conversations about why would a commercial organisation want to spend money ultimately in providing this additional service for someone who isn't necessarily their most common customer. So I just wondered, how have you approached that and what have you learned?
Well, I think that's the question for you first, Caroline.
So can I just clarify? So is the question who pays for the developments?
No, just in terms of who's paying for the production of the content.
I mean, why should anybody pay?
Yeah. Because obviously the audience isn't going to, or we're assuming that the person who's reading the lay summary, we're not expecting them to pay for it. So how does one go about convincing an organisation to invest in that kind of service?
Is this linking to the open access, as in paying for the article to be accessible?
Who
paying
pays
for the plain language summary?
Because
there must be a cost in generating them.
From the publisher's perspective, it's literally just another paragraph. So for us, it doesn't cost us anything more to do a plain language summary, because we're not writing them. We are just asking the authors to do a plain language. So we're not creating them ourselves.
But didn't you just tell us they're not very good, what the authors write?
Well, I think they're getting better. They are definitely getting better, yeah. I mean, it's been a learning curve. I will be honest and say some of the early ones, they were not optimal. We're definitely seeing them increase as guidance comes out, like the Open Pharma recommendations, GPP4. So as we're getting more understanding about how to write them and like reading tools like the Fleisch-Kincaid Readability Index, I think we're really seeing an increase in ability to write and publish successful plain language summaries. We're definitely seeing an evolution in format as well. For example, when we first started seeing submissions, they were mostly text format. Now we're seeing way more infographics than text format. So hopefully the data on open access and plain language summaries and their impact will hopefully encourage authors to invest more time in doing them. And there's lots of free resources out there to help inform the writing of them. So does that answer your question? So
let me ask Sarah. I mean, you're obviously putting quite a lot of resources into this.
Yes.
Why are you doing that?
To make it accessible, to get that information. Patients have the right to receive an information in format that's easily understandable. So yes, we do with medical writing agencies put more into that now, and we've planned for that in the budget.
And how many other companies are? Do you know? Are lots of companies doing it, or just a few?
Do you mean routinely?
Yeah.
I think we may. Sorry, I think.
Do you know?
Look, I run SciencePod. My name is Sabine Louette. We create those plain language summary for a living. So
who's paying you?
Exactly. And that the likes of companies, pharma companies, are prepared to do this on the basis that they know it will increase the impact of their clinical studies. So they know that potentially this will get the message across to the community they're trying to reach. Now, we've also had experiences where learned societies are willing to pay. We have experiences where publishers are willing to pay as part of their own content marketing approach. So it's not as black and white as it may seem, and I think there's a lot of interest as long as you can prove that this is going to enhance the impact of, the original study. So yes, I'm second Caroline by saying in an ideal world you'd want the scientists to do it, but in the real life, scientists are too busy. We have a global network of professionals who can do that very well. And why not combine the effort of a professional with the review by the author? And that's what we've been doing as part of our processes, and we've developed very precise, processes to deliver. So yes.
You're very polite in saying scientists are too busy. I think the reality is they can't do it. They're so used to writing what Michael McDonald called decorated municipal Gothic, but they find it hard to write in plain language.
The other driver that has been, at least in Europe, is the fact that European Medicines Agency made it mandatory for clinical studies submitted to the agency to include a plain language summary. So that when there's a regulatory driver like this, companies do find the money to do it.
Right, thanks. Another question, comment here?
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to the panel. Henry Spielberg from BMJ Journals. Question about the peer review of plain language summaries, and it's really interesting kind of hearing Adeline's experience in particular. So my understanding is with a text-based plain language summary, that might be submitted with the paper and then just undergo peer review as the rest of the paper would. The question is anyone briefing peer reviewers or journal editors on how they should or could handle these? Is there a kind of understanding on the part of the journal editors and the peer reviewers of what they're being asked to look at? And kind of as a follow-up to that, do then the plain language summaries end up changing as a result of changes to the paper following peer review?
Yeah, I think I will actually deflect that question to Caroline, as I'm really on the submitting end and not that end of it. Yes, to answer that question, yes. Journal editors and our journal portfolios see peer review is really important to us, so we are briefing our editors and peer reviewers on, not just from plain language summaries that are submitted with the article, but for example, ADIS submit them if they're submitted after the article is accepted, which is not uncommon. So sometimes we've got to go back to the original peer reviewers and ask them to review plain language content again. So we have a comprehensive guide for the peer reviewers. So it's exactly what Adeline was saying. We need to make sure, both from a lay perspective and from an expert perspective, that the plain language version is reflecting accurately the scientific abstract, that it's not veering into saying something else, that it is clear, that it's understandable, and it's fair balanced as the abstract is. So, but it's been a process to educate.
And have you got patients reviewing it as well?
We sometimes it depends. Some article types we do, but because our audience isn't patients, our audience at Springer Nature is informed lay audiences, not specifically patients. So
What's the difference between an informed lay audience and a patient?
Well, from the Springer Nature point of view, I think our bread and butter is scientific audiences, but it could be like generalists, it could be community care, it could be GPs, pharmacists, nurses, not necessarily your high-level specialist oncologist, for example, who will understand the data. So if we can't get patients to review, we will, for example, in-house, we will get, if it's a dermatology plain language summary, we might get an infectious diseases editor to have a look at it. Does this make sense to you? So we try and get sense checks from different fields.
Right. One more question, and then so who hasn't had a question? Over here. And then I'm going to, so we finish at 12:30, I'm going to ask all the people who've spoken, how they think what they're advocating is going to add to trust in science, which is where we started.
Thank you. Victoria Glasson from Novo Nordisk. Are you moving into plain language articles, so not just plain language summaries as well? Is that an option that journals will consider?
Great question, Victoria. Yeah, in a nutshell, yes, we are. Yes, and this is quite hot off the press. Actually, We've been wrestling with this for some time, but we're in the process. We are accepting plain language versions of full articles. So, for example, for those who might not have come across them, there are publishers already doing these where, say, for example, you've published your data in New England Journal, there's a chance to then publish a plain language version of that article in another journal, which is absolutely fine in terms of the ICMJE secondary publication rules because you're aiming at a different audience. So yeah, ADIS are actively accepting, encouraging plain language articles at the moment. We're putting together guidelines as we speak, so we hope to have guidelines available before end of the year.
Well, wait a minute, this just sounds bonkers. I mean, why wouldn't you have the plain language article full stop? I mean, what, you've got an unintelligible one and an intelligible one.
Well, yeah, good question. But apparently New England Journal's pretty awesome, apparently. So I'd love to publish it in ADIS, but we can't compete with that. But what we have heard anecdotally from pharma, for example, that they're getting more requests for the plain language versions of high science articles than the actual New England article. So.
Right. Okay. So I think now I'm going to ask each of our speakers to just give us a few thoughts on whether what they're advocating will add to trust in science or whether it'll make it worse, perhaps. So, Adeline, could I ask you to go first, or is that a bit unfair, as you're sitting there?
No, that's fine.
Will plain language summaries increase trust in science?
Yes. You know, if we're giving people information in a way that they can understand, yes, quite simply. You know, a lot of this distrust comes from the not understanding the processes necessarily, or being historically excluded from the conversation. So allowing these different audience types to join the conversation by speaking in their own terms absolutely will increase trust.
Yeah, a friend of mine wrote a piece in the BMJ. This is like the Reformation. You know, previously only priests could communicate with God. You had to communicate with God via a priest. Yes. But now you can communicate directly with God. Richard, is this going to increase trust in science?
I was just going to continue your analogy, actually, because one of the things Luther did was insist that Bibles and religious creeds were written in the native language, and then, of course, Gutenberg printed it and made it available to the ordinary people. And, of course, people got burnt at the stake for translating it into English. Oh, yeah, well, yes, yeah. Oh, absolutely. But then, of course, you also had to teach people to read. So that's my point, actually, about this, because I think it's important that all of this is seen in wider context. So, for example, plain English is used, certainly increasingly in cancer trials in the UK, to keep participants informed and indeed engaged. You know, retention is a problem. You actually want to keep them on the study. So as well as sending newsletters out to the recruiting sites, you start publishing things for the patients and the participants. Patients are also asking for things not just written in plain English, but actually written in the style of a tabloid newspaper. So you not necessarily language, but you reverse the content. You know, we want the conclusion first. Has the trial discovered something that's going to help us or not? Then you can get into the background, the methods, the results, and all the figures that we don't understand. We have had on research involvement and engagement some plain English abstracts. We insist on a plain English summary, not plain language, plain English summary. We have done since the day the journal started in 2016, and we have had one or two people produce plain English abstracts, but the order is still wrong. But it's academic abstracts. If you can do that, you can do it for a conference. And if you start doing it at conferences, if you start doing your abstracts that way, you are one step further forward. Plain English summaries are actually quite necessary to get academic funding, or they're necessary to start thinking about your participant information sheet, which has to get through an ethics committee, and if you're in pharma, your lawyers, in order to recruit participants in the first place. So half of this work, for me, as a layperson looking at it from the outside, is actually being done. Scientists and researchers and pharma can put stuff in front of people because that's how you recruit them into the studies. It's just one step further to actually saying, let's have the results and the outcomes in the same way.
Good, thank you. Caroline, just to say we're going to go a few minutes over, but it'll only be a few minutes, I promise. Caroline.
I really hope that...
Do you want to stand up?
Yeah, of course. I really hope that accessible summaries do help increase trust in data, because thinking about it, I think the first step to getting trust is to bring everyone to the table, and by involving the lay public and the patients in the creation of accessible summaries and in the review and then at the reading of the data, I'm really hoping that this transparency will encourage conversations and at least get everyone talking and yeah.
So it's a hope.
I hope, yeah, I'm hopeful, yeah.
Sarah.
Yeah, so echo that. I mean, I think making the information accessible to all can only help. I think there's a way to go. Getting them linked in PubMed is so important so that they are there for people to find. I think also plain language summaries in certain countries are still perhaps classified as promotional. So I think there's a shift in thinking going on. But yeah, I think we're getting there, and I think it's helping.
Good, thanks.
So I'm more focused on open research practices and embracing those.
Do you think that will increase trust?
Yeah. So I do. I think making them more the norm, more in sort of the day-to-day research process, I think that's really going to help to increase trust because it makes things more open. You can see how, you can look at methods and see how things were done. You can see the data. And then I think also incorporating things like lay summaries into that and interlinking everything, just making the whole thing more transparent and more accountable so you know who did what and who was involved in which aspect. I absolutely think as we begin to see more of this happening, it will increase trust.
Good, thanks. Chris.
Thanks. I'll move away from the speaker. I think you were freaking out about that a moment ago. So I think it's all part of a journey. I think open access is only one part of the puzzle. And I think open access combined with plain language summaries, combined with other initiatives that we've got as Open Pharma, such as multi-layered publications, etc., where people can dive in and out at the level that they're comfortable with. I think all that is going to increase transparency and trust in the research that we do. So I think it's all part of a puzzle and all part of a journey that we've been on.
Good. Thanks very much, Chris. So let me give you a last bit of further reading. I don't know whether any of you have heard of Nora O'Neill. She's a philosopher in Oxford. She did a Reith lecture a few years ago about does transparency increase trust. She wasn't talking specifically about science, but it was a very interesting thing. So I suggest those of you that want to pursue this further, read that. So can you all thank our speakers?